Hello and welcome to the Autism, ADHD and Us 3 podcast with me, Jenny Lucas. We'll be talking all things neurodiversity, including late diagnosis, parenting and everything else that comes in between. This podcast is not intended to be diagnostic. I am not a doctor. These are our personal experiences, peppered with research and occasionally the experiences of others. The podcast is intended as a supportive guide through the experience of parenting neurodiverse children as a late diagnosed person, hopefully bringing some relatable stories and laughs along the way. Any relevant links will be in the show notes. Let's get into today's episode. Hi everybody and welcome along to the first episode in the first season of Autism, ADHD and Us 3. Now this is a podcast that I'm hoping to create that would be the kind of podcast that I was looking for when I first got my diagnosis of ADHD and then subsequent diagnosis of autism at the age of 37, I think I was. And then finding out also that I have got two AuDHD daughters. So it's going to be a little bit of quite a lot of personal anecdote stuff and hopefully some relatable things along the way that you will identify with and feel reassured by, and hopefully some other tips and tricks as well as to how to cope with all of those things as part of your... Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. If you've got any comments or anything that you'd like to share, then do me a little review at the end. But let's get started. So basically, this is the introductory episode. I'm going to try not to make it too long. And if there was a title for this, it would be, How did you not know you were neurodivergent? How did you get to the age of 30 odd without realising that you were neurodiverse? Now, I'd love to know how many of you out there have wondered the same thing about yourself or indeed been asked the same blooming question. And it's something that I still kind of ask myself to this day. But I think for me, a big part of it was masking and not knowing that I was masking. And also the information that I had at the time about how autism and ADHD and neurodivergence in general presents in women and girls. I had no idea. And I was a teacher, a secondary school teacher for 16 years. And even then had a very limited, general stereotyped idea of what autism looked like and what ADHD looked like, and was one of the people that believed the statistics at the time that it mostly affected boys. It wasn't something that we ever saw in girls, really, which now that I've done a bit more investigating into it and had my own diagnoses into girls that have got ADHD, I know is absolute bollocks. I should probably at this point introduce myself and the two other characters in this story that are the Us 3 part of it. I'm Jenny Lucas. I was a secondary school teacher for 16 years. And there's an important reason why I mention that in the context of today's podcast, and we'll probably mention it more over the time that I'm recording podcasts. And I also have two daughters who are ADHD. We've got eldest child who is 11 and youngest child who's currently 8. They have not yet decided how they want to be referred to on the podcast, as in using their names. So I will let you know as we go along what avatar names they come up with for themselves so that I can talk about their experiences too. But I found out in 2022 that I was ADHD first, that I had ADHD, and then a couple of months later found out that I was autistic. And I did not go into the year of 2022 imagining that by the end of it I would have realised that I was neurodiverse and have one child also diagnosed as AuDHD and another child on the pathway to being diagnosed at the start of 2023. Now, part of our family unit is my husband. He doesn't really want to be part of the podcast in terms of like personal details, etc. He will come up in conversation, but there are 4 of us in this nucleus family. It's just that there's 3 of us that are willing to share our experiences with neurodivergence at this point, hence the title Autism, ADHD and Us 3. So going back to what I was saying earlier on, I got to the age of 37 without really having any idea that I was neurodiverse, because I had no idea what neurodiversity meant, looked like, or presented. And it was actually sort of towards the end of 2021 where I started to see some more things online about ADHD and like relatable things like, oh, I do that. I do that. I feel that. I experience that. Started to have lots of little tiny, like pingy light bulb moments that made me think, gosh, maybe I had better look into this a little bit more. And it was more around the ADHD at that time than the autism. So that is why I sort of went down the track of looking to be assessed for ADHD to begin with. And then as time went on, the more I learned about comorbidities and other things that can exist with ADHD, autism is obviously a big one. I then went into investigating how autism can show up in people who are. I also came across Samantha Craft's list of autism traits. What is it actually? Samantha Craft's list of autistic traits, unofficial, and how that can present in women, and that like ticked lots of that off. So highlighted lots of that pre my assessment with Psychiatry UK, and that kind of gave me a bit more grounding to see how the diagnostic criteria related to me and how the traits showed up in my life. But for me and for the girls, it all came about sort of in the pandemic. Like lots of people's sort of awakening and light bulb moments came as part of the pandemic. And as part of the pandemic, I was working full time as a secondary school teacher. As we went into the pandemic in 2020, I was in quite a hectic full time role as an assistant director of music in a school. I was also a head of a house, so a pastoral leader. And at the start of 2020, just pre-pandemic kicking off, I found out that my role and several other roles within the school were going to be being made redundant. So for quite a lot of that time during lockdown, when we were all working from home, it was actually a bit of a blessing for me because I was sort of seeing out my redundancy working from home, which was quite nice in a lot of ways. And then for the September of 2020, I got another job in a secondary school as the sole music teacher and head of year 7. And that was a real baptism of fire. Going into that in the year where kids went back to school, hadn't been to school for months. We had a year 7 cohort that I was head of that came in that hadn't visited the secondary school. Before that point, they hadn't had any chance to come and have tours. Parents hadn't been in, and the parents still couldn't come in because we were still under restrictions and we were all in bubbles. And so we had to manage that, which was extraordinary, really. It was just the most bizarre time ever in my teaching career, and we had they brought in all the testing, and it was just the logistics of trying to manage that as a school were phenomenal, really. And early 2021, I sort of went into the Christmas period feeling completely wiped out and run down in a way that I hadn't really experienced before. And as we came out into 2021 and secondary schools went back for a couple of weeks, and there was a lot of like, the government says this, the school says this, and there was like different rules and different expectations, and teaching remotely from inside my classroom when the government was saying stay at home, and there's all sorts of different things going on that just kind of finally led me to actually have a bit of a break. And so I think it was March of 2021 I got signed off from work for quite a significant period of time. Well, a couple of months at least. And at the start of that sign-off period, I actually ran myself into the ground, preparing and recording cover lessons for all of my classes, so that at least up until Easter, all the cover teacher would have to go in and basically press play on the Google Slides presentation, and there was me talking in the videos, giving demonstrations. I'd set up all the tasks, I'd set all the things to come up at the times that they were supposed to in terms of all the tasks that they had to do in the classroom, online. I basically ran myself into the ground to make sure that I had prepped those lessons for those children right up until Easter. And if any of you that are listening are teachers, you'll kind of understand where I am coming from that perspective. Anybody else in any other industry will be like, but you were signed off. Like, surely there was somebody else that would, cover that work for you. It's teaching is a whole different world. So that just led to immense amounts of guilt and questioning, and I did reach out to the Education Support Partnership charity, and they set me up with for some counselling. But in the initial sort of getting to know you and know what we should do with you call, one of the chap that I was talking to said, "So tell me how you relax. Tell me what things you do to relax." And I literally laughed down the phone at him, and he went, why is that funny?" And then I sort of thought to myself, and I was like, why is that funny? He went, don't you have things, don't you have hobbies, or don't you have things that you do to relax? And that was like the first crack of light for me in terms of thinking the way that I'm living my life is not the same as other people. And partly you think, oh, I'm just a teacher, I'm really busy, like I'm a parent and I'm a teacher, and like my life is really full on and I don't have time to relax or have hobbies. And that is true, certainly, of a lot of the teaching population. I would also say a lot of the teaching population are undiagnosed neurodiverse people. But it was that real moment of, wait a minute, it's not normal to not have hobbies. Is it not normal to not know how to relax, to literally not know what to do that would be a relaxing thing? I don't ever feel relaxed. Hold on a minute. And it was just that little chink, that it was like that, it pierced a little hole in the mask. And it was sort of from that point forward that then I started to question a lot more things about myself, how I present in the world, how I find things difficult, what things I find difficult, why I find those things difficult, and starting to view myself, instead of being just a shit failed human being, actually maybe there's a reason behind all of this. Over the years, I have been to the GP numerous occasions and had blood tests and all sorts of different tests done because I have felt exhausted, or I've just not felt quite like a whole person. Felt like there must be something going on. And every physical test that I've had for like thyroid or any of those sort of things, like anemia or whatever that might cause you to feel like that, I've always come back within the normal range, always come back within the normal range, constantly, 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 which then just leads you to believe that story that it's just something wrong with you. It's just you just can't handle life. You're just a failing human being. You're not as good as XYZ, and all those stories that run through our heads. And so for a long time, well, actually the whole of my life up until that point, I just thought that I just wasn't a very capable human being. I just couldn't cope with life. And I'd actually sort of come to the realization, I worked full time as a teacher for 5 years before I got married. And then in the year that I was pregnant, I did like supply work on and off while I was pregnant. And then once I had my daughter, I got another teaching job, and it was part time. So I was like 2 to 3 days a week. And it wasn't until she was a bit older and I had my other daughter that I then went back to work full time in another quite full on work environment, and did sort of full on work like that in teaching for 3 years before I kind of came to the conclusion. I just thought to myself, I'm just not cut out to work full time. I don't know what it is about me. I just cannot cope with working full time in these really high pressured, stressful, full on jobs and be a capable, caring, nurturing parent at the same time. I am not capable of this. And I always found that really frustrating about myself, because you look around the world and you look around at the people around about you and the people that you work with, and you think, how are all these people doing it? How are they all coping with like being at work for like 10 to 12 hours a day and then going home and doing more work, but they're also like taking their kids out at the weekend and wanting to spend time with them and like going on adventures and like creating these games for them to play at home and like enjoying spending time with them. And I mean, obviously social media and the bullshit that people chat to each other in the staff room portrays like the rosy side of everybody's lives, but genuinely I was like, I can't be both of these things at the same time. And so through this time of like being signed off and having some counselling through this specific situation that I had found myself in that had led to me being signed off, I just had a light bulb moment, which was, I can't go back. I can't go back. I cannot see myself there in September continuing to work, even if I reduced my hours, even if I gave up my middle leadership role as a head of year and was just a classroom teacher again. I cannot go back to that environment. And it was a whole body no. Like, I can't even describe it. It was like a brick wall. I am not going to do that. And I distinctly remember going into the kitchen to tell my husband when I'd had that realization. And God love him, he's a warrior, but in that moment, he was great. I went in and I went, I need to resign. I can't go back to that job in September. And he went, okay, sure, you whatever you need to do. And I think at that point he hadn't seen me suffering, if you like, in the way that I had been for those sort of weeks and months prior to being signed off, and then during the time that I was signed off. And I think he accepted there was something particularly toxic about that environment, but just he knew that it wasn't worth it for me to go back there. And we had to figure out what we were going to do from that point forward. And so it was through that time that I began to wonder what else I wanted to do when I grew up. And I had been a Reiki practitioner, and had done my level 2 Reiki. And so I decided I wanted to have sort of some sort of wellness business. So I've got a business called Highlight Wellness, which is sort of a holistic business, a bit woo-woo, I suppose you could say. And during that time, that year, I looked into becoming a Reiki master, so doing the next level of Reiki sort of qualification, accreditation. And it was that, I'm going to get a bit of woo here for the moment, ladies and gents. I got my master accreditation, if you will, qualification in November of 2021. And it was from that point forward that this neurodivergent landscape, the crack in my mask just flooded open, and all of this other information started to come in about neurodivergence. And I kind of went down a different pathway, but I'll probably talk about that in a different episode. But yeah, during this course of being signed off and then going back to finish the academic year and then doing something slightly different, I'm still teaching in September, but like only in a different place and only one day a week. I'm basically living off my savings and trying to build my business. I also did, during that time, I did a coaching qualification, and I had this really strong desire at that moment in time to support other women who'd been in my position in the public sector, because not knowing that I was neurodivergent, I just thought I was suffering from just burnout, just normal human being burnout, teacher burnout. The whole profession's fucked. It's the whole system needs a whole overhaul. Lots of people are struggling, and I wanted to try and support people before they got into the position that I'd found myself in, which was with a career that was in absolute tatters, on fire, in a dumpster. And so I wanted to sort of build up my coaching qualifications and be able to support other people who felt lost, like I had at the start of that process. So I did that. I did a bit of training in meditation, and I completed a Power of Happiness certificate over the course of the next year or so, and wanted to build my coaching up, and basically went from there. But I did realise that probably I wasn't at that time going to be able to go back into full time or part time teaching. The education sector felt like not the one for me, not the path that my life should be going down. And so since then, I now work for a local authority in the virtual school. I work in the education department. So I'm still working in and around education, but not front facing. It's working from home. And it suits my lifestyle a lot better at this moment in time in terms of the hours and the flexibility. The pay is not a teacher's pay, but it has allowed me lots of flexibility in my life to get to a better point of recovery from what I now know is autistic burnout. And that is something that I will talk about in another episode, because autistic burnout is not your standard burnout. It is something completely different and can have a permanent impact on your life. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of how I got to where I am and how I managed to go through my entire life being undiagnosed until I was suddenly diagnosed. As for my two girls, it was my eldest, really. I can't remember the exact timeline of events, but she was definitely showing more symptoms than I was, by way of tummy aches, physical tummy aches, and a bit of anxiety, and sort of not being able to sleep at times and things. And we ran through the whole gambit of tests for tummy aches. And if you've ever had a child with tummy aches and you've got to the point of going to a paediatrician, our paediatrician at one point very helpfully said to us, tummy aches in children are really hard to figure out. They can be lots of things. And you're like, oh, great. Isn't that literally what you are here to do, though? Isn't that your job? Anyway, but it was kind of after we did all that, and she ended up having her appendix out, and it was really, really tough time for her. God love her. I think it was the GP actually that said, could this be sort of anxiety based? And we went, oh, hold on a minute, maybe it could be anxiety based. And we spoke to school, and school were absolutely fantastic at the time. They acknowledged that she was academically behind where she should be and that she needed some interventions. And once they stepped up and sort of put little things in place, like she could have a movement break and she could have ear defenders, and she got like what do they call it? Like intensive input for things like English and maths and like pre-teach. And once they started to like accommodate her a little bit more in the classroom and just put strategies in place, the tummy aches actually massively reduced. Massively reduced. And it was sort of through that, and then through my learning about, oh, hold on a minute, this is how autism and ADHD can present in girls in particular, that we then went down the assessment route for her and found out that she was indeed AuDHD. And as my husband and I learned more about how it presents in girls, and we could identify more of that in our oldest child, lots of things started to make sense for us, and we sort of adapted the way we were parenting at home as well. And then, funnily enough, started to see those things in the youngest child, who presents her AuDHD-ness in a different way to her sister. Unsurprisingly, they're two entirely individual young people. But my husband still finds that quite interesting, how they can both have the same diagnosis, but they present in completely different ways. My youngest is does not struggle academically in school. I have the fear that she is going to become completely switched off by school because she's so bright. She is very quickly bored. She is very quickly bored by the behaviour of her peers and really struggles with like when they do childish things. I mean, she's 8. So there are the children round about her are children and act like 8-year-olds, but she is not a typical 8-year-old. Her brain is in far greater places than that of most 8-year-olds, and she can't fathom the kind of gang mentality of laughing at someone or taking the mickey out of someone or just generally making other people feel uncomfortable. She just does not get it. She cannot get on board. So she finds the behaviour of other children that age completely baffling, which is fascinating. But she's also got like a brilliant, wicked sense of humour. And so as we went through the diagnostic pathway for her, it was mentioned, although not written down anywhere, that she may well be a PDA presenting autistic person. And there's certainly times where that is evident in how she presents in life. So they both have different needs. They both present in different ways at different times. And that is one of the fascinating facets of being a neurodivergent parent, parenting neurodivergent children, is that we all have different sensory sensitivities and triggers, and it is quite a minefield some days trying to navigate all of those things and the language that we use and how we respond to things and manage our own feelings and triggers and things internally. And those of you listening out there, if you are neurodivergent or have neurodivergent children, you will know exactly what I am talking about. So that is just a brief introduction to us three with autism and ADHD. I am privileged enough to be in the position where I am working, and I have some accommodations at work which allow me to do that more successfully than perhaps otherwise I would be. My eldest has an EHCP, and she's at a really supportive secondary school that are doing all they can to ensure that she feels as comfortable as possible in a school where there's like, I don't know, 1,500 kids, and it's a busy, bustly environment, and they're all like preteens and teenagers, and the hellscape that was. And my youngest, who has just a couple of accommodations at school, but seems to be quite comfortable in her environment. So Welcome along to the podcast, and thank you so much for listening to this first episode where I'm just basically setting out the scene and introducing us. I'm planning on hopefully doing an episode at least once a fortnight, depending on how life goes. But for this first season of the podcast, I am going to be talking about different keywords that are associated with neurodiversity, a bit of a definition, and then some examples of how those show up in our lives as three different AuDHD people, and some of the strategies that we have in place as parents and as a family to try and navigate those in a world which is sometimes not set up for us to navigate those. So thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe and come back next time. If you haven't already, you can sign up to the mailing list to find out a little bit more about what's going to be happening on the podcast and anything that I've got coming up. I'm also over on TikTok. I am at audistically.me, which is the name of everything, all the publicity that's all over the podcast. I'm also on Instagram, not very active on there at the moment, and I'm also on YouTube, again, not very active on there at the moment, just slowly starting to build things up. If you want to drop me an email, I am audistically.me@gmail.com. But I will put any links to any of that in the show notes, and I really hope that you will join me again next time. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will speak to you soon.